June 1968, Phuoc Tuy Province. An American long-range reconnaissance patrol radioed back to base with a report that made no tactical sense. We count approximately 40 VC moving through Sector 7. They're surrounded. Repeat, surrounded. But we don't see who's surrounding them. The American patrol leader, Lieutenant James Cordell, had been watching the Viet Cong column for 20 minutes through binoculars. The enemy fighters were moving cautiously, but not tactically. They kept checking behind them, pausing at irregular intervals, occasionally firing single shots into empty jungle. Their body language screamed fear, but Cordell couldn't identify the threat. His patrol had excellent observation position overlooking a valley. He could see 300 meters in every direction. There was no one else visible. Then his radio crackled. Australian accent, calm and quiet. Shadow 2, this is Phantom 6. Suggest you hold position and maintain observation. We have the situation contained. Cordell responded immediately. Phantom 6, this is Shadow 2. We don't see your position. What's your location? 5 seconds of silence. Then the response that would become legend among American reconnaissance units. Shadow 2, if you could see us, we wouldn't be very good at our job. Maintain observation. Out. What Cordell witnessed over the next 40 minutes was a masterclass in tactical patience and invisible maneuver that changed how American forces understood what special operations could achieve. The Australian SAS patrol had done something most soldiers considered impossible. They'd completely surrounded an enemy force in open terrain without being detected. Not through technology or overwhelming numbers, but through fieldcraft so refined it looked like magic. The technique wasn't new. Australian and British forces had developed it during the Malayan emergency fighting communist insurgents from 1948 through 1960. 12 years of jungle warfare had taught them that surrounding an enemy didn't require visible positions. It required understanding terrain, predicting movement, and positioning soldiers where the enemy would go rather than where they currently were. The 5-man Australian patrol had been tracking this particular Viet Cong unit for 3 days. Not following directly behind them, but parallel to their route, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always invisible. The SAS operators moved so slowly that they sometimes covered less than 500 meters per day. They stopped every 30 minutes for silent observation, lasting 15 to 20 minutes. They communicated through hand signals and fishing lines strung between positions at night. They never spoke above whisper. They never cooked. They never lit fires or smoked. By the 3rd day, the patrol commander, Sergeant David Blue Morrison, understood the enemy unit's pattern completely. They moved during late morning after the mist cleared. They rested during the hottest part of afternoon. They traveled using secondary trails rather than main routes. And most importantly, they were predictable. Military units operating in familiar territory develop routines. Those routines create vulnerability. Morrison identified a natural choke point 3 kilometers ahead of the VC column's current position. A narrow valley with dense vegetation on both sides, limited visibility, and only 2 practical exit routes. Perfect terrain for an ambush, but Morrison wasn't planning an ambush. He was planning something more psychologically devastating. He was going to surround them without firing a shot. The 5 Australians split into positions that looked random but created perfect overlapping fields of observation. 2 men positioned north of the valley watching the approach trail. 1 man positioned south, covering the rear exit. 2 men, including Morrison, positioned on elevated ground, providing overwatch of the entire area. None of the positions were closer than 100 meters to where the enemy would pass. All were completely concealed. When the Viet Cong column entered the valley, Morrison's patrol didn't move. They watched. The enemy moved with increasing nervousness. Their point man kept stopping, testing the air, looking around. Something felt wrong to him. but he couldn't identify what. That's when the psychological operation began. One of the northern observers, Corporal Smokey Reed, fired a single suppressed shot into the ground 15 meters ahead of the VC point man. The round kicked up dirt. The enemy column froze. They'd heard nothing, but dirt had exploded from empty ground. 30 seconds later, the southern observer fired another suppressed round behind the column. More dirt. No sound. The VC began to panic. This was the technique American Lieutenant Cordell was witnessing without understanding. The Australians weren't trying to kill the enemy. They were demonstrating complete control of the battlefield. Every time the VC tried to move forward, a suppressed round would impact ahead of them. Every time they tried to retreat, rounds would impact behind. The enemy was being herded psychologically without ever seeing their hunters. After 20 minutes of this, the Viet Cong commander made a decision. He ordered his men to lay down weapons and wait. He'd recognized what was happening. Invisible forces were toying with them. Fighting back was pointless because there was no visible target. Running was impossible because the enemy controlled all routes. Surrender was the only rational option. Morrison radioed Cordell's American patrol. Shadow 2, send message to your command. We have 40 prisoners waiting for pickup. Coordinates follow. Cordell couldn't believe it. Phantom 6? Did you engage? We heard no firefight. Negative contact. No rounds fired at enemy personnel. They surrendered voluntarily. When Cordell's patrol and reinforcements arrived 30 minutes later, they found 40 disarmed Viet Cong fighters sitting in a group, guarded by 5 Australians who'd appeared from positions Cordell still couldn't identify, even knowing roughly where they'd been. The enemy commander, speaking through a translator, explained why he'd surrendered. We were surrounded by invisible soldiers. Fighting them was impossible. The American soldiers examined the area afterward. They found the concealed positions eventually, but only because the Australians showed them. Each position was located in terrain that looked impossible to occupy. Behind root clusters, inside hollow logs, underneath vegetation so dense that movement through it seemed physically impossible. The Australians had spent hours carefully clearing shooting lanes one leaf at a time, creating fields of fire that were invisible until you knew exactly where to look. This operation wasn't unique. The Australian SAS conducted similar tactical demonstrations throughout their deployment in Vietnam from 1966 to 1971. They called it shaping the battlefield. American observers called it ghost work. The technique relied on understanding that in jungle warfare, the enemy's mind was as important a target as his body. Make him believe he's surrounded by superior forces, and he'll surrender or flee without fighting. Make him believe resistance is futile, and you achieve victory without casualties. The statistics validated the approach. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian and New Zealand SAS forces conducted approximately 1,200 patrols. They eliminated 492 enemy soldiers confirmed, possibly killed 106 more, and captured 11 prisoners. Their own casualties were minimal. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, 1 death from illness. That's the highest kill ratio of the entire Vietnam War, achieved largely through tactics that emphasized patience over aggression and psychological dominance over immediate violence. The enemy recognized the difference. North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong forces called Australian SAS operators Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle. Captured enemy documents specifically warned units about Australian operations in ways that didn't apply to American forces. One document stated bluntly, "The Australian soldiers move without sound and strike without warning. When you know they are present, you are already surrounded." American Special Operations Forces were impressed enough to request training. Personnel from the Australian SAS taught at the MACV Recondo School at Nha Trang beginning in September 1966. U.S. Army long-range reconnaissance patrols adopted Australian techniques for silent movement, extended observation, and psychological operations. Navy SEALs trained with Australian units and incorporated patience-based tactics into their own operations. Lieutenant Cordell, the American who'd witnessed the June 1968 operation, requested and received permission to embed with an Australian SAS patrol for 2 weeks. His after-action report changed training protocols for his entire unit. He wrote, "We've been trained to find the enemy and destroy him with firepower. The Australians find the enemy and destroy his will to fight before firing a shot. The result is the same, but their method produces 0 friendly casualties and creates psychological impact that lasts long after the engagement ends." That psychological impact was strategic, not just tactical. Viet Cong units operating in areas where Australian SAS patrols were active became more cautious, moved less freely, and struggled to maintain supply lines. The fear of being watched by invisible observers disrupted operations more effectively than conventional military pressure. Entire enemy companies would abandon positions not because they'd been attacked, but because signs suggested Australian patrols were nearby. The ghost work technique required skills most soldiers never developed, moving slowly enough that local wildlife ignored you, reading terrain so precisely that you could predict enemy movement hours in advance, maintaining absolute silence for days at a time, communicating through minimal signals that carried no sound, and most importantly, having the patience to watch enemy forces for extended periods without engaging, waiting for the perfect moment to demonstrate control rather than simply inflicting casualties. By the time Australian forces withdrew from Vietnam in 1971, they'd proven that invisible presence could be more effective than visible firepower. The technique influenced special operations doctrine globally. Modern reconnaissance units still train in Australian-developed methods for extended silent observation and psychological battlefield control. The Americans called it ghost work. The Australians called it proper fieldcraft. The enemy called it terrifying. And everyone who witnessed it understood that sometimes the most effective military operation is the one where the enemy surrenders without ever seeing who defeated him.